So, how exactly does this work? There's been a lot that has been said about what it does and what it doesn't do and stuff like that. What exactly happens with NaProTech? Basically, just to make it as simple as possible, it's listening to the language of the woman's body. Let me say that again. Listening to the language of the woman's body. Now, I said you're going to have to study the menstrual cycle, right? So, adapting that chart I talked about initially, the Croydon model fertility care system, you can get further information on that by just typing that. A simple Google search will give you all the information you need. So what happens is, because of the importance, I said three things initially. You observe the cervical mucus, you monitor the system, and then of course, you pay attention to the hormones. You see, everything that happens in the body is intrinsically linked, is seriously linked to your hormones. Things like dieting, things like just the way you function naturally, because of the importance of the hormones. Fertility, or infertility as the case may be, is very, very much linked to hormones. So it's important to know how hormones work in order to be able to know how the natural procreative method works, the technology, the NaProTech. So basically, just spend a few minutes, I'm going to say some biological jargons. Basically, what happens is, so the brain sends a signal, right? And that is which selects a follicle inside the ovary. The ovary that produces the egg gets a signal from the brain. The stimulating hormones, the follicle stimulating hormones. For short, it's called FSH, follicle stimulating hormones. That's the signal that is sent from the brain to the ovaries, to stimulate the ovaries in order to release the follicles. I said something about follicular stage initially, don't forget. And now what now happens is the follicle produces something called, pay attention to this, estrogen. That's one of the hormones. Two major hormones that you cannot do without when you're talking about the menstrual cycle are estrogen and progesterone. So after getting the signal, I'm talking about the ovaries, getting the signal from the brain to stimulate hormones. Now that follicle that is stimulated produces something called estrogen. When the estrogen rises to a certain level, the ovary signals the brain again. You see, there's a communication. You can put it that way. Signals the brain, and then the brain triggers another hormone called the luteinizing hormone. What does that do? What does that hormone do? It simply helps to mature that follicle that has been stimulated and the egg, right? And with the help of, pay attention, progesterone. Now, why am I mentioning all of this biological jargons? Like I said, these hormones are the things responsible for the functionality of the entire reproductive system. You can see there's a communication between the brain and the ovaries, one sending a signal to the other. So when the progesterone is secreted, what happens? The follicles rupture, and then what happens is that the eggs are released. That is the one you call ovulation. They are released into the fallopian tubes. They are emptied basically into the fallopian tubes, and now produces, the egg. And it's important to pay a lot of attention to the way these things work, because after that ovulation, then you now get to what we call the luteal stage. If there is the presence of the sperm around the time you experience the ovulation, of course there'll be fertilization, and then you can successfully say I'm pregnant, right? But if there isn't, now there is another communication between the ovaries and the brain, again working with those hormones I mentioned. Now there is a reduction, of course, in the level of the progesterone, in order to tell the brain that, there was no sperm, so I'm not fertilized, so this egg can as well go. And that goes through the phase called the luteal phase. Now, if there is no pregnancy, that is what eventually comes out as the one people call blood, which is what we call the menstruation. So this is the way it's supposed to work normally. Now, what NaProTech does, why I needed to say all of this, what NaProTech does is to monitor if all of these things I've said works the way they ought to. And if they don't, then there is a medical intervention, and that's the technology part of the NaProTech. It might mean that you might need to stimulate or secrete more hormones, just the way people with diabetes would need insulin, right? The pancreas doesn't secrete as much insulin, so you need to either inject it or get something to help the insulin. In the same way, if none of these things are working well, I'm talking about the secretion of the estrogen, of the luteinizing hormone, or the progesterone, these three important hormones, then the NaProTech comes in order to balance it up and make your body work the way it was actually made to work. I mean, I could give you the analogy of even a car or anything of sort. You know that you cannot afford to drive a car with no oil or no fuel or things like that. And if there's any problem, you take it to the mechanic and he says, okay, no, it's the fuel or it's the oil or it's some other part of the car. And then they fix it and then the car begins to work well again. So it's something that might be a very poor analogy, but the point is, NaProTech helps the body to work naturally. That's why it's called natural procreative technology. All of the details of this, of course, will be discussed with your OBGYN gynecologist, and then they will help you to chart. And then there will be a monitor. They'll be monitoring, the secretion of the hormones and the way it is reacting. Of course, some of these things can be observed by observing that cervical mucus. That is why it is important to always observe it, because it could reveal or not the natural functionality of all of these things I just said. So it's a question of getting a physician and help chart all of this. By the way, this NaProTech is an example of what we call the natural family planning. The natural family planning is an umbrella term for any kind of procedure that helps the body to work naturally. It's as simple as that. So I'm talking about the Billings method, I'm talking about NaProTech, and I'm talking about what we eventually discuss, which is fun. We'll talk about that. So pay attention to these biomarkers. I'm talking about those hormones and what they do to the body. So the chart is supposed to identify whether or not there is abnormal bleeding patterns. I'm talking about the ways you could know whether things are not going right. Abnormal bleeding patterns, limited cervical mucus. I said something about monitoring it. The timing of the ovulation, the length of the luteal phase, of the cycle, and things like that. It also could time, the blood tests, ultrasounds, single and series. There's always an analysis of the, the seminal fluid. I'm talking about the man now. And surgical assessments. There's a lot of, like I said, biological jargons in this. But all you need to make it simple, meet with your physician, with your gynecologist, and say, okay, I want to chart my menstrual cycle. So pay attention to the natural functionality of it, because it's sure that the reason one is infertile most of the time is because something is not working well. So just meet a physician who knows this, of course, rather than bypassing the problem in order to have a child.